Right, well, good evening, everybody. I'm Glenda Easterbrook. I'm standing in for Barbara Julian today because she's been so busy researching for her presidential talk in May. Welcome to everybody. We think we've got about up to 80 people due to join us this evening. Whether that number will or not is a matter of conjecture, but we've got a lot of nice people here. It's nice to see you all, particularly those from abroad. One of the advantages of the Zoom meeting is that you are able to join us, which is lovely. I think I would ask everybody to keep them. You are all muted, and if possible, not to unmute yourself. And when the lecture starts, you may wish to switch the view button to speaker rather than gallery view, and then you should actually be able to see the slides and the lecture. Our lecturer tonight is Dr. John Condren. Welcome, John. And he's going to be talking today about the title of his talk is the Negociant has no scruples when it comes to the security of his commerce, Geneva and the Huguenot affair, 1703 to 1705. Now, Dr. John has a PhD from St Andrews, which he obtained in 2016. And his subject on his PhD was Louis XIV's diplomatic relations with the small states of northern Italy. He's in the last stages of completing a book manuscript based on his PhD, and he subsequently became a lecturer at the University of Limerick and at St Andrews. His current post is a research associate at Oxford on a European Research Council project entitled The European Fiscal Military System 1530 to 1870. And he's working on a case study on Geneva's role in this system. He has research fellowships at the British School of Rome, the Beinecke Library at Yale, and Archbishop Marsh's Library in Dublin, the latter of which he's going to be taking up this coming March. So I'd like to welcome John Condren, and we're all looking forward very much to seeing your lecture.
Thank you very much, Glenda, for your very kind introduction. And indeed, very many thanks to Vivian and indeed to the Society for the invitation to speak to you all tonight. As you said, I'm hoping to get to Marsh's Library in Dublin in March, but one can never make any definite plans. And for the last 2 years, that has been the case. However, it is really nice that I'm really pleased and gratified that so many people have been able to join tonight from so many different places. And that has been one advantage of the pandemic, which hopefully that will remain as part of academic seminars and conferences into the future, even if it does mean that you miss the opportunity of actually meeting people in person and so forth. I'm just hoping that you can all see a PowerPoint on your screen at the moment. Yeah, that's grand. Thank you very much. So as Glenda mentioned, I'm currently a research associate on the European Fiscal Military System project based at Oxford, which is headed by Professor Peter Wilson, of whom many of you probably know the name, especially with his work on the 30 Years' War. We are investigating the role of non-state actors in facilitating military business and how states had to rely on private enterprise of various kinds in order to fund and organize their military ventures. So we are looking at 6 different so-called hub cities and their environs. So London, Amsterdam, Genoa, Vienna, Danzig, and indeed the Baltic region more generally, and finally Geneva. So for various reasons, these cities had different reasons for being important in this so-called European fiscal military system. For instance, ports such as Genoa and Danzig could play an important part when it came to the moving of supplies and manpower from one region of Europe to another. In political and diplomatic terms, Vienna was the nerve center of the Holy Roman Empire and the entrepot for negotiations regarding the provision of mercenaries from the smaller German states to other European powers. Bankers and financiers from a city like London, where the Bank of England was in the late 17th century in its infancy, but beginning to assume greater importance as a centre of finance for Britain's allies. So London and Amsterdam were major financial centres and banking centres for precisely the purposes which we are investigating, purposes of funding warfare. This lecture focuses on Geneva. Now, we all know Geneva was a bastion of Calvinism in the 16th to 17th centuries, and indeed of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. So I won't take up too much time in explaining how this small city of some 20,000 people and only about 30 square miles of territory became a beacon of the Calvinist faith after the Reformation of the 1530s and 1540s. You're all familiar with John Knox's celebrated description of the city as the most perfect school of Christ on earth since the days of the apostles, as well as the strict regime of consistorial discipline introduced by John Calvin and Theodore Beza, and about which numerous historians, most prominently William Monter and Robert Kingdon, have written so much. So this lecture divided very simply into two parts. Firstly, I will introduce you to the reasons for Geneva's commercial importance and subsequently to its banking significance in the 17th and early 18th centuries. And secondly, to the individual, a kind of case study for this lecture, if you like, Jean-Henri Huguenot, who is a French Huguenot banker, emigrated after the Edict of Nantes, settled in Amsterdam, but ended up during the War of the Spanish Succession using Geneva as a temporary base of his operations. So firstly, I need to give you a very brief explanation of Geneva's international situation. Its political status was complex. The city was ruled by the House of Savoy until the early 1530s, when political revolution accompanied religious reformation. Thereafter, Geneva was independent for almost 3 centuries. The city was not a member of the Swiss Confederacy until the Congress of Vienna of 1815, in the immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. However, it did rely on the most powerful Protestant cantons in the Confederacy, i.e. Bern and Zurich, to protect it against real or potential Catholic enemies. So the most prominent of these were the Dukes of Savoy, who never truly accepted Geneva's independence and who wanted Geneva back. The infamous Savoyard surprise attack on Geneva in December 1602 ended in a chaotic shambles, and is something which is still celebrated on the 11th and 12th of December every year in Geneva, just how this tiny city managed to repulse an army of Savoyard mercenaries who had tried to surprise the city by night, but ended up being beaten largely by, well, in some part by the women folk of Geneva throwing iron pots down and hitting the soldiers on the heads, those few who managed to make it beyond the walls of Geneva and into the city. So as I said, something of a chaotic shambles, but this incident was the closest that Geneva came to being subjugated by a foreign power until it was annexed to the First French Republic in 1798. And even then, that only lasted until 1813, when Geneva regained its independence and, as I said, became a canton in 1815, so formally a member of the Swiss Confederacy. So with regard to France, Geneva received a form of protectorship from the Bourbon monarchy, which varied in its degrees of benevolence. For instance, Henry IV was naturally enough sympathetic to Geneva as somebody who was an ex-Huguenot and who took a genuine interest in the city's protection against his own enemy, the House of Savoy, whereas later on in the mid to late 17th century, Louis XIV viewed the city with distinct suspicion. So all of this means, with its complex and multifaceted relationships with its nearest neighbours, France and Savoy, means that Geneva lived under a perpetual fear of annexation by either of these two powers, and was also treated as a kind of a necessary nuisance, or a little brother who had to be looked after at all costs by the powerful Protestant cantons of Zurich and Bern. Geneva's actual territory was minuscule, as I mentioned already, and this meant that the city was extremely dependent upon France and Savoy for its food supply, indeed for imports of grain. And it also meant that the city was afraid to not cooperate with demands placed upon it in wartime because of the potential that particularly France could turn off the supply of food to the city and could use this power, this leverage, as a kind of bargaining chip. Now, France's complex relationship with Geneva obviously had a lot to do with religion. Again, as you all well know, before and during the French Wars of Religion in the 16th century, Geneva was a vital centre of Protestant preachers and printed texts, as the city authorities tried their best to evangelise France, or at least to sustain the Protestants fighting against the Bourbon monarchy and their crusade for toleration of their faith. And because of this role as a Protestant capital, Geneva also attracted a multitude of Protestant refugees, most especially from France and the north of Italy. These refugees brought their artisan trades and expertise with them and secured permission from the city authorities, who were in desperate need of revenue after the 1540s, to establish themselves as merchants and traders in the city. Geneva was famous for the production of various forms of cloth and textile, as well as clocks and jewellery, as indeed it still is. And the city also became a leading marketplace for the buying and selling of silk, thanks to Italian families from Piedmont, Tuscany, and Milan, such as the Diodati, the Teratini, the Calandrini, and the Fatio. So the Italian presence in Geneva, which really dated from the 1540s and 1550s onwards, was extremely pronounced. And many of these names, you see them in the council registers for the entire period that I'm looking at, from the 1550s right up until the Napoleonic period, as generation after generation continued the trade that their forefathers had brought to the city. And as historians such as Anne-Marie Pugh and Liliane Motu-Weber have shown, Genevan merchants were, it didn't just confine themselves to one particular trade, but liked to diversify in order to safeguard their various investments and to avoid insolvency. So French Huguenot families likewise settled in Geneva, especially after 1550, and what is known in Genevan historiography as Le Premier Refuge, during the reign in particular of Henry II of France, whose extreme persecution of Huguenots, so many of them flee into exile. And it really is a case of coals to Newcastle to explain to the Huguenot Society just how the revocation of the Edict of Nantes also contributed to the dynamic of a small city's population, which had to take in almost 5,000 French Huguenots in the 10 to 15 years after 1685. As historians such as Hébert Luthi, Claude Frédéric Lévy, and more recently Guy Rowlands and Vivian Lamini have pointed out, this exodus gave rise to what has been described as a Huguenot international, a diaspora which was scattered across Europe, comprised of merchants and traders with branches of their families in major commercial centres, such as Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, Lyon, Antwerp, and indeed Geneva. And indeed, again, as I'm sure you well know, it was Luthi who pioneered the idea of this Huguenot or Protestant international via his massive 2-volume work, which traced these networks of connections, exchanges, and interactions in minute detail, covering the period from 1685 up to the French Revolution. From an international perspective, Geneva played a crucial part in French trade abroad. The city was, indeed still is, located on the Rhone River just beyond France's frontier, and with excellent access across Lac Léman or along its shores into the heart of the Swiss Confederacy and thence into Germany and indeed as far afield as Poland and Scandinavia. So trading routes from Geneva proliferated in all directions, south into Italy, west into France, north into the rest of Switzerland, and up into Germany, and also with these valuable connections to French seaports such as Marseille via the inland trading city of Lyon. The Compagnie de Levant, for instance, which is founded by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, French Surintendant des Finances, in 1670, relied upon Genevan merchants as go-betweens for trade with the Holy Roman Empire. And this was for goods such as spices, which were imported into Marseille from the east, were taken up the Saône River to Lyon, and from there transported along the Rhone to Geneva for onward transit to the markets of Central Europe, or indeed to be smuggled back into France itself. So many French merchants colluded with their Genevan counterparts in smuggling goods sent out of the kingdom back into France, because there was every likelihood that they would fetch a better price, especially as Geneva was at the epicenter of smuggling routes into the Dauphiné and Burgundy, meaning that merchants acquired this knowledge of how to avoid French customs duties on the various luxury items that they imported and then exported back to where they had come from. So as I've said, alternative routes to Geneva also existed across the Alps from the Italian ports of Livorno and Villafranca. And as Anne-Marie Pugh and Lilian Motti-Weber have shown, these routes from Italy across the Alps were particularly important for the transport of spices from Portugal and the Levant, again involving these networks of Italian merchants in particular, who had settled in the city in the 1500s. So all of this concentration of trade increased and aggravated Geneva's long-standing commercial rivalry with the city of Lyon, which was the most important commercial city in 17th century France. Certain goods such as English cloth and Indian spices were cheaper at Geneva than they were in France's second city, which meant that the merchants of Lyon struggled to compete. That said, Lyon and Geneva were also twin cities in a certain sense. So yes, there were rivals, but also the commercial and familial connections between the most prominent trading families in these two cities meant that they existed with a kind of duopoly or axis of commercial interactions stretching right back to the early years of the 15th century, when Geneva hosted quarterly fairs, which subsequently moved to Lyon during the reign of Louis XI in the 1460s. So even though merchants of Lyon struggled to compete with Geneva in certain senses, it didn't mean that cities were necessarily strict rivals. Many Huguenot exiles to Geneva after 1685 had emigrated from Lyon, and Huguenot exiles frequently took advantage of royal edicts after 1685, which aimed at ameliorating the damage done to French commerce by the exile of thousands of Huguenots in the 1680s and 1690s. For instance, it was made, Louis XIV's edicts in 1686 tried to encourage Huguenot exiles back into France in order to carry on their business by reassuring them that they would not be persecuted for having committed the crime of going into exile in the first place. So many Genevan merchants with widespread connections abroad moved into the field of banking in the late 17th century, and they based their banking ventures upon the capital which they had accrued through trade in luxury goods abroad. Their services, specifically for the moving of money and paper as specie, were indispensable. It is also important to emphasize that Geneva was where many French merchants sent stocks of coins to be reformed and then to be smuggled back into France to be recirculated at a new higher value when the time was right. So in the frequent debasement of French coinage in the 1690s and early 1700s, as the French state tried to fund the 9 Years' War, and particularly the War of the Spanish Succession, many French merchant bankers stored up stocks of coin at the old value, sent them abroad across these trading routes to Geneva, where they could be reformed, basically, and their value augmented, and then sent back into France in order to be recirculated again. So this trade in the smuggling and clipping of coins was actually a mainstay of Geneva's clandestine economy, especially in the early 1700s. The War of the Spanish Succession, which began in the early summer of 1701, saw Louis XIV allied with his grandson Philip V, the first Bourbon monarch of Spain and its empire, along with some minor German and Italian allies, pitted against a grand alliance comprising the Holy Roman Emperor, many of the larger German states and electorates, in particular Brandenburg, Prussia, and Hanover, the Dutch Republic, Great Britain, and after 1703, the Grand Alliance included the Duke of Savoy. So both sides needed to move money quickly to troops in the field and to ensure payments to contractors and enterprises for supplies and equipment. And the easiest way to do this, relatively speaking, was to tap into existing trade networks using the services of merchant bankers who relied upon the bill of exchange as their means of transporting money quickly between cities and far-flung regions of Europe. So using the bill of exchange, i.e. written promises to draw upon a correspondence credit in a distant commercial centre, was a far easier and quicker way than trying to accumulate the necessary amounts in gold and silver, especially given Europe's shortage of bullion in the 17th century due to a fall-off in the imports of silver from South America. And cities which were technically neutral between the belligerents, i.e. a city such as Geneva, could play an important part in these trading and banking networks. Because so much French trade went through Geneva, the city was destined to play a crucial part in French efforts to get enough money to France's armies fighting the Savoyards and the Austrians in Piedmont and Lombardy, and on a lesser scale to French forces in Germany and Flanders. So again, Geneva's geographic location at a crossroads in Europe was extremely important because of the Alpine routes in the trading of luxury goods, which stretched across the Alps. So Genevan merchant bankers had networks of correspondence in precisely the cities that France needed to get money to, particularly Genoa and Milan, in order for that money to be used for the paying of France's armies. So rather than relying exclusively and wholly on France's own bankers in order to effect this trade, it was easier to use Genevan bankers because of their pre-existing commercial contacts and networks in northern Italy. However, as the costs of foreign exchange amplified as the War of the Spanish Succession went on, then this reliance on Genevan bankers proved something of a false dawn because of the fact that Genevans could charge extremely high exchange rates and ensure that they themselves didn't lose money on these transportation of money that had to be converted from French livre into Italian scudi, for instance. As Guy Rowlands has shown in 2 books published in the last decade, France's reliance on paper money left it wide open to the manipulation of international bankers. And indeed, some of Louis XIV's own subjects, most particularly an individual who may well be familiar to a lot of you here, Samuel Bernard. And Bernard took advantage of the crown's chronic lack of coin, which led, as I've said, to frequent debasements of the currency, and also took advantage of the state's consequent need to print more and more money in the form of state bonds and mint bills. These were effectively promises to pay the stated amount in coin at a future date. And the French state churned out hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of mint bills, particularly in the years following its most chronic battlefield defeats, 1704 to 1706. Bernard was connected with several families of Genevan merchant bankers who allowed their credit in Italian cities to be used for the transmission of bills of exchange. And not only were they charging increasingly high rates of exchange on these transactions, but Genevan merchant bankers were frequently conducting this business for more than one master at any given time. And this is a quotation from the French resident agent, or i.e. envoy in Geneva during the War of the Spanish Succession, Pierre Carriot de la Closure. And it's describing one particular trading firm, Leland and Nicolas. Leland and Nicolas have a trading house open at Lyon, La Turenne, and also here, i.e. in Geneva. And they're conducting business for Monsieur Bernard and Demeuve for the Italian remittances, i.e. the money that needed to be transported to France's armies in Italy. But they are also doing business for the Duke of Savoy in Switzerland. This is a commerce of banking, i.e. a commerce de banque, which is permitted in all cities which are free and independent and which is impossible to prevent. So this letter was written just after the Duke of Savoy abandoned France late in 1703, in the autumn of 1703, in order to join the Grand Alliance of Louis XIV's enemies. The quotation also reflects the fact that these bankers were plugged into regional networks of banking and commerce which dictated their own interests. The involvement of Geneva's merchants in war business also had unsettling effects for the city's political life, with opposition manifesting itself in 1703 through the medium of anonymous printed posters and broadsheets, which denounced various of the city's bankers for their apparent willingness to sacrifice the city's manufacturing and artisanal industries on the altar of their own ambition. Now, despite Le Closure's comment that this so-called banking on both sides was impossible to prevent, some monarchs did actually find ways to chastise the city. So even though there was an overarching or a threat of withholding of the city's grain supplies, which Louis XIV held within his power at any given time, and of which the Genevan councils and population were all too aware, Louis never actually did this during the War of the Spanish Succession. But his enemy, the Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, did actually take quite a severe step to punish Geneva for its support of France's wartime remitting operations in the Italian theatre. So the tiny republic was vulnerable to economic warfare, to sanctions, to increased tariffs, and so forth. Not to mention the fact that French privateers frequently seized enemy ships containing goods which were the property of Genevan merchants. But more importantly, in 1702, early in the War of the Spanish Succession, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I imposed a ban in the empire on the importation of goods that had passed through Geneva or had been manufactured there. So that meant that anything which originated from Geneva, whether it was coming from France or had been made in Geneva or produced in the city, could not be sold on the open market in Germany. And this immediately deprived Genevan merchants and artisans and traders of an enormous part of their revenue because of this blanket ban on their own exports to one of the most important markets. In April 1703, the British ambassador to the Swiss Confederacy, Dr. William Allenby, wrote to the Earl of Nottingham, one of Queen Anne's Secretaries of State, in order to describe how the Genevan Council, the ruling Council of 25, had written to him to ask for his help in overturning this ban. The council informed Allenby that some 6,000 workmen were standing still because the various industries in which they were employed were paralysed by this ban on Geneva's trade. The Genevan councillors also took the opportunity to remind Allenby that during the previous conflict, the 9 Years' Wars, 1688 to 1697, Genevan merchants had indirectly facilitated British trade with France by selling cloth in France, which they had imported from Britain via Switzerland and Germany, as well as Genevan contacts in Amsterdam. And the councillors ended their letter by issuing something of a gentle warning to Allenby, to the effect, i.e. in the text here on the screen. They added, if England has not effects on this side of the world to draw upon, i.e. if England didn't have a particularly large trading credit in Switzerland and Northern Italy, Her Majesty will end up paying very dearly for the bills of exchange she may have occasion for in Switzerland or Italy. For in that case, besides the dearness of the bills, besides the charges associated with actually transmitting and transacting the bills of exchange, the drawers must also answer on such bills in specie transported out of England, i.e. that coin would need to be transported to this region in order to back up the promise contained in the bill of exchange. So the overarching picture in the early years of the War of Spanish Succession is one of a situation in which both France and Spain on one side and the Grand Alliance on the other were paying increasingly large costs for exchanging currencies and transporting money. And this was because they were at the mercy of an international network of bankers stretching across commercial capitals, which effectively could hold, as the war went on, could hold monarchs such as Louis XIV, Queen Anne, and Leopold I to ransom. And now, the second part of this lecture will introduce you to one particular individual who was deeply involved in this Europe-wide network of remitting, and that is Jean-Henri Huguenot. So the Huguenots were a family of printers and booksellers from Lyon who had emigrated to the United Provinces after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Jean-Henri himself remained in Lyon for a couple of years, but later emigrated to join the rest of his family in Amsterdam. And there were two of the three brothers. There are two Huguenot brothers with whom we are concerned: the eldest, Mark, and the youngest, Jean-Henri. The Huguenot brothers' book-selling partnership prospered, and they supplied books, particularly religious texts, to libraries and booksellers all over Europe. As a result, or as a kind of extension of their book-selling networks, which enabled them to forge contacts across Europe, they gradually became involved in a banking network of Swiss and Genevans, especially as Huguenot's sister Marguerite was married to a Genevan merchant, Jean Philibert, who was based at Lyon. The Huguenot gradually moved from merchant banking into the business of remitting to states involved in warfare. During the 9 Years' War, the eldest brother, Mark Huguenot, provided remittances to British troops fighting in Flanders. In 1702, the two brothers picked up where they left off when British troops again arrived in the Low Countries. But the Huguenot brothers managed to arouse the suspicions of the British government, which believed them to be involved in similar business on behalf of Louis XIV. And indeed, the Huguenot brothers were. In 1702, they were deeply involved in supplying money to the French armies in Flanders. And in this business, they were in cahoots with an individual I've mentioned already, the prominent French banquier de cour, court banker, Samuel Bernard. So this involvement in France's remitting gradually became known to the Grand Alliance, and the Dutch government made the position of the Huguenot brothers extremely difficult, eventually compelling them to flee into exile on pain of having their assets and property confiscated. So when they left the Low Countries early in 1703, Mark Huguenot died soon afterwards, and Jean-Henri was left as the head of the family and chose Geneva as his new base of operations early in the summer of 1703. And he was accompanied to Geneva by Louis Guiguet, Guiguet, another of his family's associates, who was from a family of Swiss bankers from the St. Gallen, which had long settled in France in Lyon. So these two bankers, Huguenot and Guiguet, were welcomed with reserve and distrust by the Genevan merchant banking and trading fraternity, because the Genevans themselves wanted to be involved in this lucrative business of wartime remittances, but did not relish the fact that somebody who was so widely known to be involved in this business had now come to settle among them. They wanted to keep this secret. They had just seen their commerce with the Holy Roman Empire basically suspended through no choice of their own. But now that Huguenot had chosen Geneva as its new base of operations, the Genevan Council frequently met early in the summer of 1703 to debate whether or not they should expel Huguenot and Guiguet from Geneva. So Huguenot and Guiguet were also suspected of acting as double agents by Pierre Cadio de la Closure, the French resident agent in Geneva. La Closure believed that these two individuals were linked to British and Dutch efforts to get money to the Protestant rebels in the Cevennes Mountains in southern France, the so-called Camisards, who had risen in rebellion against Louis XIV in 1702. So Huguenot and Guiguet were suspected by both sides, both by the Dutch and British on the one hand, for their known business on behalf of France in remitting money to French armies in the Low Countries, and by the French on the other hand, who were prepared to use their services, but also suspected them of being out to make only a profit from themselves. And this next slide holds a quotation which sums up in many ways the contemporary attitude towards self-serving merchant bankers during the War of the Spanish Succession. So when two Genevan councillors had a meeting with La Closure in July 1703 to discuss La Closure's request that Huguenot and Guiguet be expelled from the city, La Closure said that he had expected that Guiguet would redouble his denials and that he would easily take all manner of oaths without the slightest intention of keeping them. That we should know, the Genevans should know what kind of man he was. He was one without faith or law, whether Catholic or Protestant, that he was capable of anything, and that he had no regard either for the state or for his conscience in making his fortune. That it was not possible to ignore what he had previously done against France, i.e. in his connections with Huguenot in remitting money to British and Dutch forces in the Low Countries and to the Camisards in the Cevennes, as well as against his city and his magistrates. And Guiguet was also the best placed man to transport money to the Camisards, since he knew all the secret routes to take, and it was obvious that he had come to Geneva to do precisely this. So again, what I mentioned earlier about smuggling routes from Geneva back into France, it wasn't just items or goods such as silk and spices which could be smuggled, but also coin, which was intended by the Grand Alliance for the sustaining of a rebellion against France in France's own backyard. And indeed, as Greg Monaghan, the author of the standard text on the Camisards rebellion, Let God Arise, has shown, the French state had to expend vast sums of money in order to quell the Camisards rebellion, which eventually turned into something of a war of extermination against this Protestant minority. And this was sustained in part by a network of diplomats based in, of Grand Alliance diplomats based in Switzerland and in Northern Italy and the Low Countries, and also merchant bankers who sought to involve themselves not just out of a sense of religious solidarity, but also out of an anticipation of the costs that they could milk from the Grand Alliance for facilitating these transports of money. So as I said, Huguenot and Guiguet were suspected by both sides of acting against the other. And Allenby wrote to the Genevan Council in September 1703, saying that Huguenot had more or less said to him that he had come to Geneva in order to carry on the business which he had been prevented from doing in Holland. So basically, Allenby was warning the Genevan Council that Huguenot was using Geneva to carry on, using Geneva as a base to carry on this business, but that ultimately what Allenby was actually getting at in this letter to the Genevan Council was to suggest that Huguenot and Guiguet should be expelled from the city because of the fact that they were extremely likely to have their operations hampered by the French. So the Genevan Council was being encouraged to take steps to prevent Geneva from being used as a base for supplying either France or the Grand Alliance. And because the Genevan Council was lobbying the British diplomats, i.e. Allenby in Zurich and George Stepney in Vienna, to have the suspension of Genevan commerce with the Empire lifted, then it was in Geneva's own interest to prevent their city from being used as a centre of wartime remittances for one side or the other. However, Huguenot was not prepared to leave Geneva so easily. He found the city to be a convenient base for his operations, despite the hostility which his operations engendered, and despite the fact that the transactions which he carried out had to be backed up in capital, be it in paper money or in coin, based on Geneva's own volume of trade. So more and more over the autumn of 1703 and into the spring of 1704, Huguenot drained Genevan capital and took loans from Genevan merchant bankers in order to sustain his operations on behalf both of France and of the Grand Alliance. So he basically used Geneva as a kind of personal money tree, if you like, in order to sustain his increasingly expensive remitting operations. And he also dragged Geneva into these operations of remitting on behalf of remitting money to the Camisard rebels in France. For instance, early in the spring of 1704, he and the Genevan bankers Lulan and Nicolas, whom I mentioned earlier on, travelled to Lausanne in the Pays de Vaud in order to meet the British ambassador to Turin, Richard Hill, and the Dutch ambassador to Turin, Pieter van der Meer. And this was for two reasons. Firstly, because Lulan and Nicolas were involved in lending money to the Duke of Savoy. This was in order for Huguenot to consider whether or not he should sustain Lulan and Nicolas' lending of money to the House of Savoy, and also to discuss loans to Britain and the Dutch Republic for the benefit of the Camisards. But Huguenot was drifting into conflict with his own correspondents in France, most particularly Samuel Bernard. And the debasement of the French coinage, which was ordered in May 1704, just a couple of months before the Battle of Blenheim, meant that Huguenot was, who had previously invested almost 500,000 livres in buying up stocks of coin in order to recoin them in Geneva, or to have them revalued in Geneva and then smuggled back into France, suddenly found his profit margin squeezed. And eventually, in the late summer of 1704, the Genevan Council ordered him to depart from the city. So Huguenot had now lost Geneva as his principal centre of operations, and was also barred from resuming operations in the Low Countries in Amsterdam. So in order to, he now refused to honour his obligations towards Samuel Bernard and to fulfil the debts which he had contracted with Bernard on behalf of France. And despite 4 journeys which he took to Versailles early in the spring of early in the spring of 1705, in order to try to broker some kind of arrangement with Bernard, no agreement could be reached for Huguenot to honour the commitments on paper which he had taken with the most prominent banker in France. So the logical step for Huguenot, who is now threatened with bankruptcy in France, was to completely cut his ties to the French monarchy and to flee into exile in England. And he sold information on how France funded its armies to the Duke of Marlborough and to Lord Godolphin, respectively Commander-in-Chief of the British armies on the continent and Britain's Lord Treasurer. So Huguenot basically turned complete traitor to France by disclosing the extent of France's reliance upon paper money, and also the likelihood that France would not be able to sustain the war for much longer. Now, I'll wind up by explaining ultimately the end of Huguenot's career. He ultimately found himself, he managed to escape complete bankruptcy in the great crash of the Easter Fair at Lyon, the stock exchange crash of Easter 1709, and ultimately ended up in Denmark, serving as one of Christian VI's ministers of state with a special responsibility for restructuring Danish finances. But his career in Geneva for these 2 years in the War of Spanish Succession demonstrates the importance of the role of a Huguenot banker operating for one side and then another during the War of Spanish Succession, during this period in which international merchant banking was in its infancy but gaining in greater importance. And while he may have escaped the opprobrium of individuals such as the Franco-Scottish financier and banker John Law in 1720, Huguenot's career is an important exemplar of the duplicity which bankers could operate early in the 18th century, and also demonstrates how a small neutral city such as Geneva could be utilized for the purposes of arranging and transporting funds to theatres of war. So this small case study features is basically an example of Geneva's importance in this sense as a neutral hub of a focus point of banking networks stretching across Europe. And my research on Geneva stretches right up until the French Revolution and demonstrates how a small neutral city can have this extremely important status, boosted by the fact that it was the centre of a religious diaspora, which has settled there for commercial, political, and religious purposes. So again, I'm sure that not much of this will be particularly new to you, but I thank you for your kind attention, and I welcome your questions.
Well, on behalf of everybody, I'm sure they would want me to thank you for a really, really interesting lecture.